On June 12, 2019, independent senator from Vermont and 2016 and 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders gave a landmark speech at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Even though the subject was supposedly about democratic socialism, it was focused most on the 20th century New Deal and a 21st century version of an economic Bill of Rights. Even though it was more of a history lesson than a political speech, it combined the two elements very effectively with an enthusiastic audience. When you hear Bernie on the campaign trail, you hear him quote alarming statistics. 3 families control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population, which is about 160 million people in the U.S. The top 1% has more wealth than the bottom 92%, and 49% of all new income goes to the top 1%. Sanders talked about how he is personally familiar with criticisms of socialism throughout his entire political career and how red baiting since FDR's era has been very common. He quotes President Harry Truman and, of course, Roosevelt defending themselves and essentially socialism, including the famous quote from FDR's 1936 speech where he addresses his critics by saying he welcomes their hatred. He also quotes 1928 Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith, who was a severe critic of FDR and the New Deal, and a Democrat, and even Ronald Reagan, who wrote a letter to Richard Nixon in 1960 stating that John Kennedy was comparable to, quote, old Karl Marx, end quote. Fast forward to the Trump administration, he even acknowledged that Donald Trump and oligarchs love corporate socialism, but they probably hate democratic socialism because democratic socialism is for the people and not them. Sanders talked about his own political career and what he has fought and stood for decades. He goes on to say that democratic socialism to him at the core is about compassion, justice, and love. He finishes the speech going into how economic as well as social justice is about human rights, and that is what democratic socialism means to him. Then he finishes by tying the past with the present day again, and this time by mentioning FDR's 1944 speech where he introduced what he called a second Bill of Rights. And though it didn't come to fruition in his administration because he passed away in 1945, it did set the stage for his wife Eleanor Roosevelt to introduce it to the United Nations. And they passed the 1948 resolution called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now Bernie Sanders is preparing what could be the epitome of what he calls democratic socialism, the 21st century economic Bill of Rights, guaranteeing basic necessities such as healthcare, housing, living wage jobs, assistance for those who have unfortunate circumstances, daycare for children, education, and more as human rights as FDR had proposed. Finally, Bernie finished his speech saying, "Our goal together should be to finish the New Deal and establish a 21st century economic Bill of Rights."